bom dia a todos e, portanto, nós íamos começar agora a parte, como o professor Amaral explicou, íamos começar a parte das diversas intervenções. Só apresentar-me a mim, eu sou o Hugo Figueiredo, sou professor auxiliar da Universidade de Aveiro, sou investigador do CIPES e cabe-me a mim fazer esta apresentação. Eu gostava só de agradecer à EDULOG, em primeiro lugar, pela relevância do debate, em primeiro lugar, e pelo timing também, pela qualidade do painel que teremos durante o dia. E passava, sem grandes demoras, à apresentação. I'll just change to English now to say that we have a very distinguished panel of speakers today. As Professor Amaral was saying, it's a very timely debate. There is this consensual idea that diversity is a good thing in the system. There's not, as Professor Amaral was saying as well, there's not really a consensus on how to achieve it, so we'll be discussing that. Professor Ronald Barnett is Professor Emeritus of Higher Education at the Institute of Education at University College London, where he was Dean and Pro-Director. He has various honoris causa doctorates from various universities. He has published a very large number of books, a very large number of articles, lectures in over 40 countries. Has been cited many times. So I'll just give the floor to Professor Ronald Barnett for his talk.
Can everybody hear me? Yes, fantastic. Well, good morning, everybody. What a delight it is to be here in Porto, one of my favourite European cities, one of my favourite cities, full stop. And I hope I have a chance to see a little of it while I'm here. It's a great delight to be here. Thank you very much, Alberto, if I can call you that, for inviting me here and to sharing a few thoughts with you this morning. A couple of things before I start, if I might. I've had two careers. My first career was as a bureaucrat in the Polytechnic sector of British higher education. So I've seen, as it were, both sides of the game and worked and lived through the transition from a binary system in the UK to a so-called unitary system. So I have a certain amount of personal experience to share with you in a way. But I also want to just give a little bit of forewarning that I've never written on this topic, I've never spoken on this topic, I've never even much thought about this topic. So what you're getting this morning is a few almost random thoughts which may help the conversation. What I'm going to do is deliberately not get too bogged down in detail. I'm trying to paint the biggest picture. If you want to position me, my work, I'm a social philosopher of higher education, and philosophers are interested in big concepts, big frameworks, and big theories, and that's what I'm going to share a little bit with you this morning. I'm going to talk fairly rapidly because it's very important that we have time for conversation, for discussion. So forgive me if I seem to be going rather rapidly. When I'm sitting in the audience, I always like to know how many slides has the speaker got? How many slides have I got to live through? I think, let's tell you, I've got 23. And the organisers gave me, I said, we agreed on 40 minutes, and I've already used up about 5. So I'm going to have to go, as you see, at a great rate of knots, about 1 every 1.5 minutes. So just hang on to your seats. So if we're thinking about designing a new higher education system in any country, there are going to be, as it were, intended differences. And here are a few. The range of disciplines, are they going to be segregated across different universities, different institutions? The degrees which are awarded, and so on and so forth. Private, public, positioning of research, whether you have part-time students, sub-degree programs, numerous clauses, limiting numbers of students in certain disciplines, the government's situation. All pretty standard stuff, boring stuff, but they're the kinds of things that typically would come into play in any conversation. But there are also trying to move this on. There we are. But as well as intended differences, there are unintended differences. The age and maturity of students in the UK, the ex-Polytechnics have, by and large, an older student profile. The socio-economic classes, they tend to be quite different in the UK. The older universities tend to attract, and this is all around the world, tend to attract from higher socio-economic classes. Ethnicity, proximity to home. Do the students travel a long way? Cultural capital, market position of universities in the global family of universities. The labour market position, what jobs, what occupations are open to students. The money, the sheer money, the unit costs of different institutions, their position in the rankings, their global situation, all of these matters, unintended differences which come into play in any system. But then there are even murkier issues. Standards, are they going to vary across universities? Are they going to be the same for all? The quality. What do we mean by quality? How does that play out across a large system? Teaching and research relationships. We're fond of talking about, quotes, the Humboldtian University. We've got to give up that talk and become serious about the relationship between teaching and research. How will it play out across different institutions? What monies are going to be available for research in certain institutions? What's the differential status of the institutions? What opportunities, if any, are there for transfer across the institutions? What access do students have to different institutions? How fair is the admission system? What are the biases and prejudices that are lurking there in the undergrowth? What's the relationship with the state? And what size are the institutions to be? All these are rather murky issues which we hesitate to talk about in designing a higher education system. And I could almost stop there, but I'm afraid I've got a few more things to say. The nature of the world. Let's stand back. What's the big context here within which we're working, within which any system of higher education in the world, in any country, has to be designed? What's the character of the world we're in today? The character of the earth. It's in motion. We're in motion. Highly complex as systems bump into each other. We hardly know what we're going to see in the newspapers of the world or on the screens, on our screens, as we try and understand this crazy world we're in. We have, I want to put it in this way, an intermeshing of ecosystems. And these work at different levels. This is the character of the world we're in as I see it. And I want to suggest there are 8 ecosystems that in particular characterize and affect higher education. And I've listed them here. Knowledge, learning, persons as individual ecosystems, social institutions, the polity or political sphere, culture, economy, natural environment. Huge ecosystems whirling around the university and the university system, the higher education system, bumping into each other. The higher education system, the universities are spreading across these ecosystems, which are in dynamic formation all the time, always moving. But Each of these ecosystems is impaired. They're falling short of where they should be, where they could be, where they might be in the 21st century. And what is more, because of the way they worked over the last 300 years, higher education, universities in particular, is partly culpable for the impairments of these ecosystems. I haven't got time to go into all of that, but that's my opening stance. We only have to think about some of the big issues of our day: coloniality, environmental degradation, social and epistemic justice. Huge issues that many of us, both in the political sphere and intellectual sphere, all across the world, are grappling with. We have to situate higher education systems in this kind of context, difficult as it is. But then, of course, there's a more immediate context, still large, still very large. Global science has suddenly appeared, as it were, in the last 50 years, a major ecosystem of its own. The emergence of cognitive capitalism, as it's known in the literature, and the emergence of STEM. And now many of you will be familiar with the acronym STEM, Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics. But now we have to add another M for medicine. And this reminds us that knowledge is itself in dynamic flow all the time, moving in ways we can barely understand and get a grip on. Now we're seeing knowledge being favoured in certain ways, in certain directions. Bioinformation capitalism. When we had the COVID crisis, we had the Prime Minister of England appearing daily on our screens, flanked by the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer. We didn't see him flanked by sociologists or anthropologists or moral philosophers. Knowledge is moving in certain ways, and certain kinds of knowledge are favoured more than others. Knowledge in which robotics, big pharma, artificial intelligence, the military are playing their part, are shifting the interest structure of knowledge. And we have nationalism or populism, state steering, very, very strong in some states. And now an urge that universities should attend to their locality, a recovery of the civic university, and of course the dominance of rankings. But then that itself is moving, and new kinds of rankings are forming that are attending to universities' moral position, the way in which they're picking up UNESCO's sustainability development goals. So different rankings themselves are not static, they are themselves moving. Not sure where I should point this, but there we are. And so let's think of the higher education system itself as an ecosystem. What would that mean? What would that look like? What do I mean by ecosystem? I mean a large fuzzy cluster or cloud of entities which more or less hang together in some way but exhibit some kind of diversity, always in motion. Interconnected elements, self-reproducing, a tendency to go on despite anything, changing over time, some degree of tension and even conflict within an ecosystem, issues of the way in which it aligns to its wider world, yet having some flexibility. An ecosystem is fact and value combined. It's real, it exists in the world, but we also value it. So that's an ecosystem in broad conceptual terms. Sorry, go back. Can I go back? I don't want to go there. I'm now getting lost. I want to go back. I want to go back. Yes, the policy network. Just behind the higher education system as an ecosystem, there's this policy network in any country, in any developed country. Fuzzy, again, a fuzzy network of coordinating bodies, of interest groups, here in Portugal, in Europe, think tanks, and so on and so forth, research groups, bodies that hang around the think tanks, that hang around government agencies, advocacy groups, UNESCO. Wider policy network we're not to be lost sight of. So against this, which might really be preliminaries, I want to offer you three initial models of higher education, what a higher education system might look like. Stratified, separate but different, and what I call we're all in it together. So, forgive me, I'm hopeless on IT, so I'm afraid you only get my own homely manuscript diagram. Nothing fancy, but it works for my purpose here today. Here's a stratified system, a unified system, but a stratified system. And it's something like the one we have in the UK, United Kingdom at the moment. It pretends to be unified, but actually there's a pretty fairly solid line between the older universities and the ex-polytechnics. And they're scattered around in different ways. And there are subtle boundaries even within the binary system that we call a unified system. So what looks like a unified system on the outside, when you look at it more closely, is far from unified. So-called unified system. It's stratified. And here's my second model. Separate but different. Parity of esteem. Do you have anything like that phrase in Portuguese? The belief that you can have different entities, quite different, but enjoying the same sort of status. And that was the pretense when we set up the binary system in the 1960s in the UK. You could have universities and polytechnics at the same status. Of course, it never worked. It became very unstable. But this is, at least in principle, a system that you might want to aim for in Portugal. Universities, the old universities, and the new polytechnics now called universities. Parity of esteem, separate but different. And here's my third one then, to lift a phrase from a previous United Kingdom Prime Minister. We're all in it together. No boundary, no demarcation. Scattered around. Every university is distinct. No differences of status, of quality, of standards whatsoever. We're all in it together. Find your own place, do your own thing, be what you will. I want to go on from all of that and say that's not good enough. We've got to put our thinking cap on and aim much higher. We've got to develop higher education systems that are really adept to the crazy world that I was talking about earlier. So issues arise about the character of the network we're trying to form. What should the relationships be within the network, within this ecosystem we call a system of higher education? Philosophers these days want to talk about flat ontologies, a belief that the world is more or less horizontal, placed horizontally. I think that's absolutely hopeless. By the way, it's developed a huge literature in the philosophical literature, and philosophers are coming into this camp talking about flat ontologies from all sorts of quarters. I can't understand how it's ever got going. But anyway, there's a big industry now amongst philosophers talking about flat ontologies. No. We live in a differentiated world which is characterized by power and conflict. So the question arises of any higher education system and of the institutions within it, do they recognise each other? I'm sure you won't have this in Portugal. You're much more enlightened than we are in England. But I'm afraid in England, we have the situation in which you will have a major city with, say, 2 major universities, 30,000 students each or more, and they never talk to each other. So the question is, what is the character of the relationships going to be between and amongst universities within the system? The question of relationships is critical in a higher education system understood as an ecology. So when the rectors get together, what are the little groups that form around the coffee machines? Who is talking to whom? Who recognises whom as one of us? The network, if we're not careful, will start to fray at the edges. So issues arise about the character of this diversity. Diversity is not enough. The question arises as to what's going on within the ecosystem. Is it actually closed in certain ways? Or are there new possibilities of new kinds of openness? Now, I believe in diversity, but what I'm implying is that actually there are nice questions to be raised about uniformity and diversity, about closure and openness. And these are not easy questions to answer at all in this crazy world that we're in. Are all the institutions to be allowed to conduct research? Can there be different standards within a unitary system? And what other differentiating conditions might there be? Do we want to make sure that students from different socioeconomic classes are actually spread around or concentrated? I have to admit something about my own background. I went to a little, what was then a small university in the north of England called Durham University. Durham University is the most exclusive university in the UK. I'm ashamed to say. It's more exclusive than Oxford and Cambridge. Can you believe that? So there are fundamental issues about access, about openness, about fairness that we have to look at. Bottom bullet point, I don't know whether you saw that before it whizzed away. See if I can go back to it. Theorem. The more diversity you have in a system, the more there are points of closure. The more diversity you have, the more there are points of closure, the more opportunities there are for little groups to form, subgroups to form. And that's what we've seen in the UK, United Kingdom. We have clusters of like institutions, the so-called Russell Group, the elite universities, and there are all sorts of other groups. There's a cathedrals group, can you believe that? And so on and so forth. I won't just bore you with all the little groups that have formed. Do you want little groups to form? Question. Epistemic relationships. What about disciplines? We don't think about disciplines enough. Where are the medical schools to be? Who's going to do veterinary science? And what about philosophy? Forgive me for asking the question. Is philosophy to be anywhere? There is a fundamental issue in Western knowledge. We're beginning, as I've implied, to use the word science as if it means knowledge. We venerate purity. We venerate theory. The Nobel Prizes go to those who think in abstract ways. This is the kind of knowledge that we have come to venerate in the West, in the global North, over the last 200 years. Is that right? What's the balance to be between theory and practice? These are very tricky issues between blue skies research, as it's called, and what's now being called translational research. And what about the humanities? Are we going to talk about them anymore? We don't in some states, some nations of the world. Inner mobility. Movement is crucial in an ecosystem. Are the staff moving around? Who examines the PhDs? Do you have clusters of universities examining the PhDs? That's to say, can a professor in an ex-Polytechnic in England examine a PhD in an older university? Who recognises who? What is status going on in this ecosystem? All sorts of issues there about that dynamic movement of space, of both staff and students. I'm moving on quickly because I'm conscious of time and I want to say one or two other things. What about the very title of university? Is it really that important? Really? Massachusetts Institute of Technology? London School of Economics? You can be even world famous without the title of university. Does it really matter? It does, though, generally speaking, offer reputational advantage. The problem of academic drift, we know all about this. We've known about it for the last 30, 40 years. If there is implicit hierarchy, those institutions which are lower down the hierarchy will try and do all they can to move higher up the hierarchy. There are tacit systems of separation going on, and if there are, those at the bottom will try to move to the top. They will ape the older, normally it is older, institutions. They will take on their characteristics. They will try to do more research, get into the leading journals of the world, and so on and so forth. So there's a need for some clarity over roles and relationships. I now want to, on the basis of these further reflections, offer you two more. You get lots of value for money from me this morning. Two more models. Axes of demarcation. Two fundamental axes of demarcation in any system of higher education around the world. One is that of the relationship between research and teaching. What is that proportion to be? We talk about, in England, we talk about research-intensive universities and teaching-intensive universities. Actually, they both do teaching and research. The question is, what is that relationship to be? What's the proportion to be? How much do they rely on research income? So that is a key one. But the other one is unit costs. The students at Luton University, you probably may not have heard of Luton University, do not receive the same amount of money for their education as those at Imperial College London. The unit costs, to put it formally, vary enormously. There are three other factors which cut across these big axes, which are discipline. What do we do with creative arts and music? Very important for those of us who care about culture, but it happens to be a big industry all across the world. What about size, and what about the rankings, which produces this kind of model? You won't be able to see that, it doesn't matter. Dominant worldly trend, okay? Ron Barnett's characterization of where we are in the world with higher education systems. There are two fundamental axes here at work. You'll see I've got an axis of money, high and low, the vertical axis, money. Where does the money flow? How much money do the students get, as it were, for their education? Who gets the research resources? And the horizontal axis is that between teaching and research. What's the weight there to be, as I say, between teaching and research? And this produces, in my judgment, 2 clusters of institutions. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm going to speak loud. You've got a set of institutions here which are characterised by high unit costs and high research intensity. And you've got another cluster of institutions which are characterised by high teaching loads and low unit costs. And that, I suggest to you, is the dominant structure which works over time in higher education systems. But you've got crisscrossing across this nice, neat characterisation. You've got the visual arts and performing arts, because very often they're very expensive and they're high teaching. And then you've got the humanities, which don't cost very much, but which may be high up in research rankings. So you've got awkward dimensions coming into play on top of what is a relatively straightforward tacit system which develops over time. But I haven't finished yet. I've got one more model to show you, if I can get there. So the exam question that has been set for the day is quite straightforward. A binary system or a unitary system? And it's clear from what I've been saying, I think, that the answer is neither. What I'm suggesting is that we need a unitary system, but with interconnected clusters, a galaxy, if you like. No solid line of demarcation, no solid boundaries. Much more fluid, much more open. It is, if you like, a flattish ontology. More or less flat, but some bits of hierarchy coming into play. Loose boundaries, modes of difference across the institutions. And so we have the Ron Barnett ideal higher education system. Clusters, movement, fluidity. Yes? Little hierarchy, some hierarchy. What are the relationships between? How are we going to keep it vibrant? How are we going to keep it responsive to this crazy world that we're in, that I was talking about? Unless we are prepared to think in this way, we are not going to have a higher education system that's going to be adequate to the kind of world I was trying to describe to you earlier on. But then, last slide, for my conclusions. We've got this burning awkward question. Who are we going to admit into our family of universities? What are the conditions of entry going to be? Or, to put it another way, what is a university? What are we going to want of any institution that is going to call itself a university? And you can go through the old criteria of size, of standards, of range of disciplines, and so on and so forth. But the question is fundamental to what we're talking about today. What is a university in the 21st century? What should it be? Well, if you want to have a look at my work, you'll see what I've been saying over the last 10 years or so. I've been describing an ecological university, ecology in the way I've talked about, networking, open relationships, open to the world, engaging with the world in all sorts of ways. That is a university. So conclusions, if I can get there. Let's give up the binary system, but then to what? Diversity or stratification? I'm saying some stratification can't be avoided, but let's limit it. Let's keep it in its place. Let's Try and create a system that has vitality in it, it's open, energetic, responsive to this world we're in with all of its uncertainties and unpredictability. Let's not take the world for granted, but have a system that is totally responsive to its complexities. We should ditch ideas about parity of esteem and even parity of possibilities, because universities will have different possibilities available to them. The connections are going to be crucial, therefore, the relationships between universities. And don't forget my theorem, the more numerous the demarcators, the more you have separation, the lesser the integrity of the total system. So it's a total system that we need to think about, not the character of individual institutions. There are always going to be trade-offs. There's never going to be one system that's going to be right. So we need to have fluidity, openness, creativity, movement. Value judgment's always going to have to be made. But ultimately, the question comes about that old question that won't leave us alone. What is a university in the 21st century? There we are. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will open the floor to questions now. Portanto, questões, eu abriria a audiência. Temos 20 minutos para questões. E, portanto, se quiserem sinalizar o desejo de fazer alguma questão, agradeço.
You don't have to agree. On the contrary, it's more interesting if you don't agree. Or just share thoughts with each other.
If you need. Okay, so maybe I will ask a question, and then I'll ask you to think of questions to ask Professor Ronald Barnett as well. So I'm just thinking how now about like these last examples you were giving. I was just thinking of how also the higher complexity of fields, even as nursing, I was thinking or also or things even like gaming and programming, the connection between the two things, even urban planning and the role, for example, now with big data, the creative arts. So those kinds of areas, how do they fit into this diversity debate, and now you know, what kind of challenges do they create? You know, what kind of new challenges in the future do they create?
Well, that's lovely. Thank you very much for the question. Is it working? I'm sure it is.
Maybe I'll. I think now it's working, I guess.
That's a perfect question for what I've been saying. Knowledge, the way we understand the world, is not just moving very fast. It's becoming interconnected. We've been talking for 60 years, can you believe? 60 years, particularly prompted by European agencies, about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. We've been talking about it and done very little about it. But now we're beginning at last to see signs of moving in this direction. Why? Because the digital world has made knowledge much more fluid. And so the thought that we're going to sharply demarcate certain disciplines to certain institutions is problematic. It's nice for the bureaucrats and for financial managers and for the Department of Economy in the government. This university, those disciplines, that university, those disciplines. But if we want to adapt our universities to the world, and if we want to get any kind of purchase on the big issues in front of us, then we have to be transdisciplinary. And transdisciplinarity, by the way, is a much bigger concept than interdisciplinarity. Transdisciplinarity means that we listen to the world. We take account of the way the world is. and we start from there. Are we going to be able to design our universities so that they can be epistemologically fluid? How about that? Epistemologically fluid. How many how many rectors really understand their universities as a space of epistemic possibility? There are, I dream up a phrase for you. Epistemic possibility, that's the world we're in. How are we going to think of COVID? Think of COVID. I'm being told to stop, I talk too much. I'm being told I must use the microphone. That's a good idea, isn't it? You should wave, you should heckle. Think of COVID. Transport systems, culture, socio-economic groupings, ethnicity, and I haven't even started on modelling, on pharmacy, on drugs, on big pharma, and so on and so forth. Everything is interconnected. Moral philosophy, moral decisions. We cannot keep dividing up our universities and our disciplines into ever narrow, non-communicating fields. We've got to make them so that they're much more porous, much more open, within themselves and to each other. When I was a dean, I had great delight in trying to bring academics together. Lunchtime conversations, you try it, between the sociologists and the philosophers. Look at the body language. How can we engage with these big problems of the world? So where are we going to put nursing? Where are we going to put informatics? Where are we going to put computing design? We will have our allocations, but they've got to be porous, they've got to be open. Colleagues have got to be allowed to talk to other colleagues, and they're doing that more and more. But we've got to go on doing that more and more in the future. I'm not going to give you easy answers to these fundamentally difficult questions. We've got to keep these questions on the table, difficult as they are.
Alguma questão da audiência? Tem que...
Well, in your model, I see a problem, because if you go to Cambridge or Oxford or Imperial or Yale or Harvard, you get the big prize. If you go to Luton or Buckingham University or some, you know, you are done. So how can you decrease this stratification? Because it's very difficult. And I did my PhD at Cambridge, and I saw the structure of colleges where professors have lunch together every day. And so they can talk to each other, and they always do it. So, but it's very expensive. So that's another problem. How can you work with this?
Well, absolutely, Alberto. These are part of the problems that I'm trying to remind ourselves about. It's a very serious matter. Of course, there are going to be these very powerful interests, not only within the disciplines, but among the institutions. I'm at University College London, top 20 university in the world, Institute of Education, #1 in the world for the last 7 years. The Institute of Education is a very interesting case study. The Institute of Education attracts 1/4 of all the research monies in education in the United Kingdom. One institution attracts 1/4 of all the research monies in education in the country. Is that right? It may not be right. We've got to keep raising these questions. Now, coming back to Cambridge and Oxford and so forth, I said that I started off in the Polytechnic system of higher education. And when we started developing the Polytechnics in the 1960s, we drew upon universities and the university staff to help advise the Polytechnics. Not only that, we started to do doctorates in Polytechnics. So the question arose, who is going to examine the doctorates in the Polytechnics? And what we did was we drew upon academics in universities. But what is interesting is once these networks start forming, the universities themselves, when they saw a powerful department or powerful research team, would also look to individuals in the polytechnic sector to examine doctorates in the older university sector. So the question is, what opportunities are there? Are we bringing people together? Are they talking together? Are they engaging together in the local community? We've got to find ways of bringing people together. But it's happening anyway, actually. It's happening anyway with the internet. People are engaging with each other, collaborating much more. The boundaries are dissolving, almost whether we like it or not. The question is, what more can we do to dissolve, weaken, not dissolve completely, but weaken these boundaries? All the time, there are different pools of expertise cropping up. You have a new subdiscipline cropping up in a strange, and a new university will get hold of it and then become a world leader in a particular field. There's lots of opportunity now, and spaces are rising, emerging. We have to be creative, imaginative, to use the spaces that are now cropping up. There are transnational bodies like UNESCO, but others as well, European agencies, which are helping to foment collaboration across universities. And this is happening more and more. We are becoming more dynamic, more open, more porous, more fluid. I'm just trying to give it all a bit of a push and helping to become more coherent.
I would take on the same question, and I go straight into the question that I put to you. The English system, or the British system, is one of the more differentiated in Europe. Not in the titles, but in the reality. In the reality of the, as you said, of the monies, in the reality of the research intensity, in the realities, and that is more important still, of the perception in the marketplace. So my question is, would you advocate a system where the money distribution would be more homogeneous? I mean, we would nationalize all the property that the King Henry VIII gave to Oxford and Cambridge, and distribute that among universities.
Yes.
And on the titles, would you advocate that, say, in Durham, you'll take out the University of Durham in the top of diploma, and the new College Durham in the top, and you just say a diploma issued legally in England and forced students to apply to jobs without any label that remains of the story? That is the extreme.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, look, I'm a realist, and I've been trying to say that there are real forces in the world, big forces, and we can't, as it were, we can't totally buck the system. So I want University of Durham to remain the University of Durham. But there's no reason at all why a student in the University of Durham should be getting more money than a student in the University of Teesside just up the road. There's no reason at all. So we can begin to address some of the inequalities. But it's not just inequality that I've been concerned about. It's differentiation of mission, differentiation of position in the world, of the possibilities that universities have in the world. But certainly there are a whole raft of things we can start to do. We can make sure that universities are receiving monies in the same way, that it's all accountable, that it's all transparent, that the research agencies are really serious about making available their research monies to universities on an equal basis, which they're not at the moment. You know the Peter principle, to them that hath shall be given. I've been a recipient of that. It's outrageous. We can start nibbling away at the fringes of these inequities, because that will help the total vitality of the system. We're not going to change things overnight, but we must have a direction, a sense of direction, a sense of the path we want to go in. And why? Because if we're going to save this crazy little planet called Earth, we have got to produce higher education systems that are vital, that are vibrant, that are fluid, that are open, that are really going to realize their possibilities. We have created systems of higher education over the last 300 years or so, which are now totally unfit for purpose. We have got, and we can change things. We can change things. And I'm trying to put fundamental issues on the table that so that there can be no excuse anymore.
Nós temos tempo para mais uma questão. So, any more questions? So, I may actually ask a final question. Sorry, I've got 5 minutes, so I may do that. So I'm just thinking how the issue of scale, I'm actually wanting to set up, I think, the rest of the debate, because we already saw from the presentation of Professor Amaral that I think scale has been, the question of the system getting scale or institutions getting sort of scale was kind of a common theme throughout many different examples. And so I'm just wondering how do you think your view of fluidity, of sort of strong clusters and fluid clusters actually needs scale as well? And I'm also thinking if there is not a danger of having a very strict separation between types of institutions, and that strict separation allowing the lack of scale of some institutions to show up just to survive. That some institutions in a way don't have the kind of the efficient scale to survive just based on that strict separation. So how does that play out with your view of fluid and strong clusters and fluid clusters?
And by scale, we mean the size of institutions?
Well, yes, I think I'm saying the size, number of students, the resources, etc. So I'm thinking about that.
Well, these are very nice questions that we need to address. And I can only give you an untutored, off the top of the head response. There is a critical mass. But the critical mass is much less than we might think. Massachusetts Institute of Technology is not huge. London School of Economics is not huge. We can have vibrant, open, fluid institutions, which don't have to be mega. On the contrary, UNAM in Mexico City, or University of Buenos Aires, have over 200,000 students. Totally ungovernable, totally unmanageable. They don't know how many students they have. They don't even know what a student is. But on the other hand, I'm connected with a little university in southwest London, which many of you won't have heard of. It's called St Mary's University. It gained its university powers and title only 5 or 6 years ago. It's quite a vibrant place in its own way, and it's going great guns. And it's made incredible changes over the last 20 years or so to get to this point. And it's still going on developing. But it's too tiny. It's only got about 8,000 students. And that doesn't give it enough flexibility, enough possibility in the world. It doesn't give the managers and the leaders sufficient play in the resources that they have available to them. It doesn't open up enough possibilities in the world. When I talk about a university, I want to ask the question, what are its possibilities in the world? Which are the agendas of the world that it's going to reach out into? Which are the networks it's going to form across the world? So you can be too small, you can be too big, but there's an enormous range within those polarities. But I come back to my earlier point. What are your networks? You are strong because of your networks. Oxford and Cambridge are not just strong in themselves because they got all this wealth from the Middle Ages, which is enormous, but because of the networks they developed around the world. So networks, relationships within the university and outside the university. There's a big issue here, we haven't touched upon it, but leadership, university leadership. What is it to be a university leader? It is to inspire people to think of themselves in these much bigger contexts and reach out across the world. That's another topic for another day. But this issue of size is important, but there are even, if I can say so, even bigger issues of connections, mobility, interactions with the world, the way we understand ourselves. What is the mission of this university to be? Do we really see ourselves as a worldly university, connected with and concerned with the challenges of the world?
I think this is the time actually to break now for half an hour of a coffee break, so we'll return at 11:30. Regressamos às 11h30, desculpem. E para a próxima apresentação. Ok, portanto, até já.